These players had their franchises do their best to destroy their careers. Maxx Crosby was a Raven for like 4 days. The Raiders had already agreed to send him to Baltimore in exchange for 2 first-round picks, and Crosby even flew out to take his physical before the Ravens suddenly backed out. Their GM Eric DeCosta later admitted he was gutted by the decision, but then he turned around and signed Trey Hendrickson just 13 hours later. Crosby reacted by posting 3 simple words on social media: "I'm a Raider." He's back in Las Vegas, but he's also stuck back in the same building that had just tried to move on from him. That's exactly what we're talking about today, because sometimes talent isn't the problem, the organization is. Maxx came in as a 4th round pick in 2019 and worked himself into being the best player on the Raiders by his 3rd season. He has 5 Pro Bowls and 69.5 career sacks to his name, mostly because his pass rush motor never stops running. There's no coasting or taking plays off with him, and he gives the organization every bit of energy he has on every single snap, playing over 90% of the possible snaps each season. He'd stuck with him through 4 GMs and 5 coaches, but the Raiders kept on losing and losing despite his elite status. They benched him for the final 2 weeks of the 2025 regular season and responded to Crosby's loyalty by trying to ship him to Baltimore for 2 first-round picks in March of 2026, trying to pull a fast one on the Ravens. Now that the deal fell apart, it'll be interesting to see how this will affect him going forward, but so far the Raiders are trying to ruin his career. We have to start this section at the most basic level of organizational failure, which is the simple refusal to protect your quarterback. Andrew Luck was supposed to be the next Peyton Manning. Taken 1st overall in the 2012 NFL Draft out of Stanford, Luck came in and immediately delivered. He threw for 4,374 yards, 23 touchdowns, and got a Pro Bowl selection as a rookie. The guy was truly special. By 2014, he threw for 40 touchdowns, one of the best seasons any quarterback had that year. But here's where everything fell apart. The Colts consistently put Luck behind one of the worst offensive lines in the league. Year after year, he was running for his life, taking hits that no other franchise QB should ever absorb. And the result was a brutal injury cycle that never stopped. 2015, a sprained shoulder, lacerated kidney, and partially torn abdomen muscle. 2016, concussion and more shoulder issues. 2017, he had shoulder surgery so severe he missed the entire season. And then a calf strain heading into 2019 that never healed properly. By August of 2019, at just 29 years old, Andrew Luck walked away from the NFL mid-preseason. Not just because he lost the love of the game, but because his body had been put through a cycle of injury, rehab, that he described as leaving him with emotional scars. He won over 53 games, had over 170 touchdowns, and threw for over 23,600 passing yards. He made 4 Pro Bowls, and he never played a single snap outside of Indianapolis. But the Colts didn't just fail to protect Andrew Luck, they broke him. And when a franchise fails its quarterback that completely, retirement at 29 isn't really a surprise. But Luck wasn't the only QB to be failed by a bad O-line. David Carr entered the league as a 1st overall pick in 2002 with a rocket arm and the kind of footwork that made him look like a legitimate star. Houston drafted him from Fresno State to be the face of their brand new expansion franchise, but the problem was they forgot how to build an offensive line before they put him on the field. During his rookie year, Carr was sacked 76 times, and that number still stands as an NFL record that will likely never be broken. In the modern era, a coaching staff would be fired long before a player took that much punishment, but Houston just let it happen. To put that 76 in perspective, Carr had already absorbed more sacks by week 6 than most quarterbacks take in an entire 16-game season. The Chargers alone sacked him 9 times in a single afternoon. This wasn't just bad luck, because the Texans knew their O-line was terrible before the season even started. Instead of fixing the protection, they kept running Carr out there to get hit. And he ended up leading the league in sacks for 2 of the next 3 seasons. By his 3rd year, the game showed a player who was completely broken. And you could see the hesitation before the snap and a quick release driven by fear rather than the scheme. The Texans essentially manufactured a bust, and when he finally left Houston, he had 59 touchdowns against 65 interceptions. The thing is, the Texans weren't the first team to even pull this move on a young player. Only 3 years earlier, the Cleveland Browns did the exact same thing to Tim Couch when they made him the 1st overall pick of the 1999 NFL Draft. Couch was supposed to be the savior of the relaunched franchise, but he took 56 sacks his rookie year and suffered multiple fractures. By the time the Browns made the playoffs in 2002, Couch got injured in front of his own crowd, and the fans actually cheered when he was down on the field. When a city cheers for their franchise quarterback getting hurt, you know the organization has poisoned the relationship between the player and the people who were supposed to support him. Luck, Couch, and Carr followed the same tragic track, where they were the first picks of a rebuilding team that refused to invest in protection. The front offices kept drafting skill players and running the same broken plays while defenses figured out exactly how to exploit their lack of offensive line. None of these guys ever had a real chance to show what they could actually do at the professional level, which is insane to think about because Andrew Luck was still so great. There's a version of David Carr's career that looks completely different with a competent line, but the organization destroyed his potential before it even had a chance to develop. While those players were physically broken by their teams, the next situation we're looking at was much more calculated than that. Washington didn't just fail Robert Griffin III, they actively dismantled him. The front office handed over 3 first-round picks to bring him in, watched him break, and then had the nerve to blame him for being broken. Back in 2012, RG3 was easily the most electric player in the league. We aren't just talking about him being a great rookie, because he was arguably the most dangerous quarterback to step foot on the field that season. He finished that year with 3,200 passing yards, 20 TDs, and only 5 interceptions, which helped him post a massive 102.4 passer rating. He walked away with Offensive Rookie of the Year honors and dragged Washington into the postseason for the first time in half a decade. His legs made professional defenders look like they were standing still, yet his arm was sharp enough to shred any secondary that cheated toward the line of scrimmage. The system Mike Shanahan built was a perfect fit, using a heavy dose of the read option to put the ball in space and let Griffin create. For one glorious season, that plan worked perfectly. The wheels started coming off in December that rookie year. Griffin suffered an LCL sprain late in the schedule, but instead of letting him heal, Shanahan kept him on the field. That knee held together just long enough to reach the playoffs, but everything collapsed during a wild-card game against Seattle. In the fourth quarter, Griffin planted his foot and his ACL simply gave out on national TV. The team knew he was compromised before the kickoff even happened, yet they sent him out there anyway. You can't put that decision on a 22-year-old kid who just wants to compete for his teammates. The adults in the room had a professional responsibility to protect their franchise investment from his own competitive drive, and they failed miserably. What followed that injury was truly insane. Griffin returned for the 2013 season, but that signature explosiveness was gone. Since he couldn't threaten the edge with his speed anymore, the read option became a massive liability that defenses started to feast on. Opposing coordinators adjusted by using spies to take away the run and forcing him to win from the pocket. Once Shanahan was fired, Jay Gruden took over and installed a completely different system. It was a traditional pocket passing offense based on dropbacks and strict timing, which was the exact opposite of what Griffin needed. In 2014, he lost his job to Kirk Cousins, and by 2015, he was buried at 3rd on the depth chart before being cut in March of 2016. This is where the blame on the organization becomes impossible to ignore. After his firing, Shanahan went to the media and claimed Griffin had asked for a change to the offense after his rookie year. He tried to frame the young QB as difficult to coach or a diva for wanting to move away from the hits. Most people will call that a player trying to protect his health so he could actually have a career, but the team used that request as a weapon against him in the media. The front office traded away a future to get him, built a scheme that relied heavily on his legs, and then ran him into the ground on a damaged knee during a playoff game. They never bothered to build a functional passing game to help him once his mobility slowed down, and they forced him to learn 2 different systems under 2 different coaches in just 3 years. When the whole thing inevitably fell apart, they made sure the public narrative pointed the finger at the player instead of the building. Cleveland eventually signed him in 2016, but he only lasted 5 games before eventually breaking his shoulder and effectively ending his time as a starter. His NFL career lasted 8 years on paper, but he only appeared in 56 total games. Almost every bit of his meaningful production happened in that one rookie season when Washington actually had things line up. While the mess in Washington was loud and played out through leaked quotes, the situation with Vince Young in Tennessee was a slow burn. It wasn't as flashy as a playoff injury, but the damage to his career was just as permanent. Young entered the league as a 3rd overall pick in 2006 because the owner, Bud Adams, absolutely had to have him. The problem was that the head coach, Jeff Fisher, reportedly wanted Matt Leinart instead. That massive gap between what the owner wanted and what the coach believed in actually never went away. It stayed there, bubbling under the surface of every meeting and every practice for 5 straight years. If you look at the actual football being played, the case for Young was incredibly strong. He won Offensive Rookie of the Year and earned a Pro Bowl nod after going 8-5 as a starter for a team that began the year with 2 straight losses. His dual threat talent was real, as he put up 552 rushing yards and averaged nearly 7 yards per carry. The league didn't have an answer for him yet, and the game showed a guy who could clearly win at the highest level. Fisher eventually benched him in 2008 when Kerry Collins led the team to a 13-3 record. You can defend that move because the team was winning and Collins was playing efficient football. However, the way Young was treated after that season proved this was about more than just wins and losses. Even when he was outperforming the players around him, the job was never truly his again. In 2009, Adams had to step in and force Fisher to start Young after the team started 0-6. Young responded by putting up a 98.6 passer rating that year, proving he could still play. He wasn't a bust, he was just a player who was never trusted by the man responsible for his development. Everyone remembers the 2010 meltdown at the end of the road. After a tough loss, Young threw his shoulder pads into the sands and walked out without talking to anyone. He reportedly told Fisher to his face that he wasn't running out on the team, he was running out on the coach. It's very easy to look at the outburst and say Young was the problem, and he definitely deserves some of the blame for how he handled it. But that moment didn't happen in a vacuum. because it was a result of 5 years of playing for a coach who never wanted him there in the first place. Tennessee finally released him in July of 2011, leading to a backup stint in Philadelphia, where he made the Dream Team comment that haunted the Eagles that year. He got one last look in Buffalo in 2012, but he was cut before the regular season even started. His career ended because the Titans spent 5 years fighting an internal war instead of supporting their quarterback. By the time he hit the open market, the rest of the league had already decided he wasn't worth the headache. Some players really get used the wrong way, but Young was used as a pawn in a power struggle he could never win. The next two legends on our list were handed something much rarer, which was sustained and undeniable greatness, yet they still couldn't find a way to make it work because they were stuck in Detroit. Barry Sanders stands as the most elusive running back to ever step onto a football field by almost any metric you want to use. He went to 10 Pro Bowls and racked up 15,269 career rushing yards while maintaining a 5.0 yards per carry average across a decade of play. During the 1997 season, Sanders rushed for 2,053 yards and took home league MVP, but the Lions only managed a 9-7 record and immediately lost in the first round of the playoffs. That was the ceiling for his entire career. The end came in July of 1999 when he announced his retirement via fax while traveling in London, leaving him just 1,457 yards short of breaking Walter Payton's all-time rushing record. Fans and media members talked about that specific number like he was turning his back on league history. What those critics missed was what Sanders eventually admitted years later in a documentary where he explained that the passion for the game had simply vanished. He looked at the roster and he didn't see Detroit as a series Super Bowl contender. So even though his mind and body felt fine, he decided he was just done with it all. Barry didn't just walk away because his talent had faded or because he couldn't play at an elite level anymore. He left because the Lions organization never gave him a legit reason to keep putting his body on the line. There was no sustained success and no credible plan to actually win a championship, which left Sanders in a loop of organizational futility, where his only job was to be spectacular inside a broken machine. And Calvin Johnson represents the second chapter of this exact same tragedy, and his story played out almost 17 years later. He walked away in 2016 after 9 seasons at only 30 years old, leaving the game as a Hall of Famer who was still in his absolute prime. Back in 2012, he set the single-season receiving record with 1,964 yards, but the Lions finished that year with a miserable 4-12 record. His most dominant statistical seasons happened on teams that went 0-16, 2-14, and 4-12, which is a heartbreaking waste of generational talent. The Lions only made the playoffs a single time during his 9 years with the team, and they lost that game in the first round. During his Hall of Fame induction speech, Johnson opened up about the physical toll the game had taken on him. He talked about the severe and persistent pain he dealt with for years, a weight that built up season after season because he simply refused to sit out regardless of what his body was screaming. He reached a specific moment where he knew his time in the league was coming to an end, and he felt at peace with that because he knew he had left every bit of himself on that turf. He didn't say it directly, but the record shows he sacrificed his health for a franchise that gave him almost nothing back in terms of team success, and then they tried to rob him blind once he did retire. These are two of the greatest skill players to ever play the game of football, and both of them chose to walk away while they were still at the top. Sanders hit that wall at 30, and Johnson hit it at 30 as well, which proves that the number isn't a coincidence. It's a deadline that losing eventually imposes on even the most gifted athletes. Detroit didn't just break these men physically over the course of a decade, the organization broke their reason for showing up to work, and in a lot of ways, that's much worse than an injury. Barry and Calvin at least played in the spotlight where everyone knew their names and respected their game. The next guy spent nearly a decade being just as dominant, but nobody watched because the team was so bad. The St. Louis Rams drafted Steven Jackson with the 24th overall pick in 2004, and he went on to spend 9 long seasons with the franchise. During that stretch, he put together 8 straight 1,000-yard rushing seasons, which is a streak only matched by legends like Emmitt Smith, Curtis Martin, Barry Sanders, Thurman Thomas, and LaDainian Tomlinson. Every single one of those backs is currently wearing a gold jacket in the Hall of Fame. Jackson hasn't received that honor yet, and the reason for that snub comes down almost entirely to the rosters the Rams built around him. The peak of his career came in 2006 when he rushed for 1,528 yards and 13 touchdowns while also catching 90 passes out of the backfield, which stood as the 6th highest total in a single season in NFL history at that point. He made the Pro Bowl and was easily one of the 5 best players in the entire league that year, but the Rams still finished 8-8 and missed the postseason. That mediocre record was actually the high point of his tenure because St. Louis followed it up with a season of 3-13, 2-14, 1-15, 7-9, and 2-14. Between 2007 and 2011, the team won a grand total of 15 games over 5 years. Jackson was out there every single Sunday taking the ball 300 times a year against defenses that didn't respect the passing game because there was nobody else on the field worth stopping. By the time he left the Rams, his personal record with the team sat at roughly 45 wins and 100 losses. We need to be honest about the physical cost of that kind of workload. Running backs who take 300 hits a year behind a struggling offensive line do not age gracefully, and they eventually get ground down into the dirt. When Jackson finally left for Atlanta in 2013, his body had already absorbed a decade of punishment for a franchise that never bothered to give him a real supporting cast. He never got to experience a deep playoff run or play in a game that actually mattered in late January. He retired in 2015 without a single Super Bowl appearance or Hall of Fame induction, and he still lacks the national recognition his production actually earned. When you look at Steven Jackson, he was one of the most complete and versatile running backs of his entire generation. He was a bruising physical runner who could actually catch, block, and make defenders miss in the open field. The Rams repaid that versatility with a decade of losing and a career that gets overlooked every time the Hall of Fame conversation starts up again. He wasn't invisible because he lacked the talent to be a star, but rather the organization gave him no platform to be seen by the rest of the world. Most of the players we've talked about today had their careers end before we could really process what we were seeing, but Myles Garrett is different. We know exactly what he is because we watch him dominate every single week, yet we are also watching his prime years vanish inside an organization that gives almost nothing back. Look at the numbers Garrett put up in 2025 when he broke the NFL single season sack record by hitting the 23 mark. By reaching that, he moved past Michael Strahan and TJ Watt, who had been locked in a tie at 22.5, and he shattered his own Browns franchise record in the process. He became the first player since 1982 to put up at least 12 sacks in 6 straight seasons, which included a massive 5-sack performance against the Patriots. After that record-breaking game, head coach Kevin Stefanski called him the Defensive Player of the Year, and even admitted he would have voted Garrett for MVP if he had the power. The reward for that historic run came just 5 days later when the Browns fired Stefanski. It was another coaching change, another total reset, and another offseason of pure chaos for a player who had been nothing but elite since the day he walked into the building. Cleveland took Garrett with the first overall pick in 2017, but in the 8 seasons since that day, they have cycled through coaches and dealt with a quarterback situation that stays in constant turmoil. The result is 0 playoff wins for the best defensive player on the planet, and at 30 years old, he has still never played a meaningful game in January or February. The Browns are still stuck in a rebuilding phase that looks exactly like the one they left before he even arrived. The thing is, every year that goes by without a real team around him makes his career look more like the tragedies we've already covered. So there you have it, when a franchise destroys your career. Thanks for watching, and subscribe if you're new.